Hello everyone, welcome to the Period 2 Mega Review. This video contains all the key information you need to know for Period 2 for AP US History. This includes all the key terms and their explanations, all the major primary sources that are very likely to be on stimulus-based multiple choice questions, and the very important topic of comparing the Massachusetts and Virginia Bay colonies, which are very common questions on multiple choice questions, SAQs, and LEQs. Also, I highly recommend taking notes in the video because that will greatly help with retention. And if you want to skip to any important parts that you might be struggling on, timestamps are below in the video notes, so check those out. Finally, this video can really help you do well on any AP US History test that covers Period 2, and it would also be a great review for the AP test in May. All right, good luck everyone, let's get started. Hello, welcome to APUSH Simplified. Today we're looking at the famous Mayflower Compact, written in 1620 during the voyage of the Pilgrims and others to establish the Plymouth colony. First, let's put the document into historical context. In the early 1600s, Great Britain was catching up to other European powers, especially Spain, who had suffered a major defeat with their failed invasion of England a few decades prior. The Virginia colony had been established, but was in need of more settlers. In other important developments, the Protestant Reformation had swept through Great Britain several decades prior. Henry VIII cemented a split with the Roman Catholic Church, which then created the Anglican Church of England. However, some people within Great Britain felt the Anglican Church needed more Protestant reform. One of those groups were the Puritans, who followed Calvinist Christian beliefs, including that of predestination. At certain points, Puritans were persecuted for their beliefs, as they ran counter to the official teachings of the Church of England. A subgroup within the Puritans were the Pilgrims, who felt they needed to completely separate from the Church of England. This small group was able to line up a few investors for a Plymouth colony in the New World. About 102 settlers set sail for Virginia on the Mayflower. An important note is that not all of them were Pilgrims, and there was a real divide aboard the Mayflower between the Pilgrims and others, who they referred to as the strangers. Trouble struck when rough seas blew the ships off course, and they would need to land well north of the Virginia colony. This caused heightened tensions between the Pilgrims and the strangers on board the Mayflower. The divide threatened the whole journey as mutiny was a real possibility. An agreement was signed between the strangers and the Pilgrims, we know as the Mayflower Compact. Now, taking a look at the compact itself, an important detail is that it mentions King James as their sovereign, and the colonists would remain loyal subjects. This was probably a compromise between the strangers and Pilgrims, as the Pilgrims were originally seeking complete separation. However, the strangers had no intention of it. Next is the Christian faith is very prevalent in the documents, as the grace and presence of God is mentioned. The purpose of the Mayflower Compact is for a social contract that establishes law and order for the sake of survival. A few key quotes include, "Covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation. And by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinance, acts, constitutions, and officers, from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony." End quote. Finally, let's look at the impact and legacy of the Mayflower Compact. The early years of the Plymouth colony were very difficult. Half died in the first year alone. However, despite the difficulties, the colonists worked together. Also, more settlers arrived and set up small towns nearby. These commonwealths had a degree of democracy, as male church members could vote on local laws and issues, and they all sent representatives to a general court. This shows an early successful attempt at democracy in the British colonies. Hello everyone, today we're going to cover one of the biggest topics in early US history, and that is Virginia and Massachusetts Bay colonies. Now, the common thing College Board questions like to ask about these colonies is to compare various aspects about them. There have been many multiple choice and SAQ questions contrasting the colonies on AP tests, and it is likely one of the LEQ options will be about this topic. So let's analyze the colonies by comparing and contrasting them. First, I want to get this out of the way. Personally, sometimes I jump around when I am describing these colonies between a couple of different names. So let's take a quick look at the different references for these areas, starting with a big area and working our way down to the small. The northern colonies is really everything north and east of New York. This area is also called New England. Now, the most populous colony and the hub of activity for New England is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the principal city is Boston. There are many smaller towns, also known as commonwealths, in New England, but the first and most widely known is where the Pilgrims first settled, which is Plymouth. Now, skipping over the middle colonies and venturing further south, we have the southern colonies. The most populous colony in the south is Virginia. The major focal point of trade and commerce is the Chesapeake Bay area. The first permanent settlement was Jamestown. Okay, let's move on to context. So if you're just starting out in APUSH or any history course, you'll need to understand context or contextualization. I like to think of this as setting the scene, meaning what is going on in the larger world of the topic you're focusing on. In this case, Virginia and Massachusetts Bay colonies. And how does that topic fit within the larger world? One contextualization strategy is to set it up like the trailer for a big blockbuster movie. So it might go something like this. In a world where Spain has dominated the colonization of the Americas, and other Western European nation-states are struggling to catch up, there has been a great schism in Christianity between Protestants and Catholics, and the slave trade from West Africa to the Caribbean and the Americas is picking up, which is supporting the production of cash crops, sugar, and tobacco. Two small struggling English colonies on the coast of modern-day Virginia and Massachusetts are fighting for survival. One group came because of their strong beliefs in Puritan Christianity, and the other for possible riches, but both were influenced by the opportunity that the New World offered. Okay, so I hope you can see what I did there. I started out with the wider world and then narrowed down relevant themes and topics to what we were focusing on in this video. You'll need to do something similar in your DBQ and LEQ essays. For my students, I like it to be done in the intro paragraph. So you would write the context first and then immediately follow it up with a thesis to complete the intro paragraph. Okay, now let's get into the colonies. First, let's take a look at their origin stories, and we'll start with Virginia. A few decades prior, the British had attempted to establish a colony in the New World, but it failed. The colony was Roanoke, and there is a fascinating story and deep historical mystery about it, but that will have to be a special video for another time. Then we had the Virginia Company, which was a group of investors looking to fund an expedition for possible riches. On the actual journey, there were several leaders, but the most prominent and well-known historical figure was John Smith. These men were seeking riches like gold, silver, or anything else of tradable value. When they arrived in Virginia, they would find none of those riches, and instead they found death. The first few years were awful. The Jamestown location was swampy and buggy, and the expedition had a hard time feeding itself. There was a local, powerful Native American confederacy led by Chief Powhatan. There were brief skirmishes between the English and the natives, and this is where the embellished tale of Pocahontas begins. Eventually, a short-lived peace is achieved, which greatly benefits the beleaguered settlers. Another John Rolfe, would introduce the cash crop tobacco to the colony, and side note, also marry Pocahontas. And the colony's fate was sealed in the cash crop. Also, important note, as demographic comparisons between the colonies is commonly asked about. The Virginia colony was mostly made up of young men, while the Massachusetts Bay colony will be made up of families of peoples of all ages. Okay, just to let you know, I'm color-coding the slides. Red is for when I'm talking about the Virginia colony alone. Blue is for the Massachusetts Bay colony, and gray is for when I'm talking about both of them. All right, the origin story of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Several decades prior, the Protestant Reformation swept through England. Some felt the new Anglican Church that replaced the Catholic Church was not reformed enough. One of the groups were the Puritans. Puritans suffered periodic persecution in England, and a small group of them wished to completely cut ties with England and attempt to build a Christian utopia. These were the Pilgrims. After floundering around in the Netherlands, the Pilgrims eventually were able to gather a few investors and set sail for the New World on the Mayflower. The journey was rough, and they were blown off their course for Virginia and ended up settling farther north. Like in Virginia, the first year was difficult. 50% died. However, local Native Americans aided the Pilgrims and helped them farm the sandy region. In return, the Pilgrims allied with the natives to war with other tribes. 10 years later, Puritans, who had similar religious beliefs as the Pilgrims, but still wanted to remain with England, however, arrived in the New World with a colonial contract. They were a joint stock company like Virginia. However, not nearly the same level of profit motive. As mentioned before, this colony was made up of families, young and old. Side note, not all were Puritans. There were a sizable number of regular British settlers. Agreements were made, like the famous Mayflower Compact, to have good relations between Puritan and non-Puritan settlers. Okay, now on to geography. The northern colonies are in yellow on the map, with our area of focus, Massachusetts Bay, being right on the Atlantic seaboard. The principal city, Boston, had a good harbor, and there were good fisheries in the area. The winters are long and cold, while summers are generally wet and warm. Good soil for growing a variety of crops. The growing season is short, and the area is not conducive for large-scale cash crop farming. Most people are a subsistence farmer, with the ability to sell only small amounts of excess produce. The Virginia colony is in green on the map, and also on the Atlantic seaboard. Their harbor is okay, however the climate is much nicer than Massachusetts, as the winters are short and the summers are warm along the coast and hot in the interior. The soil in the area varies in quality, with some parts being swampy, but many things can grow, and farmers focus on the cash crop tobacco. Moving on to relations with the local natives. In Virginia, we already discussed the Powhatan Confederacy and their origin. However, Chief Powhatan lost some control, and his brother was far more hostile to the English settlers. There were periods of trade and peace, and also warfare. In the 1620s, war with natives, debt, and disarray led to the Virginia Company Charter being revoked and changing to status of a royal colony with a king-appointed governor. This changed things and had a more clear organization. That brought peace agreements with native tribes and a clear demarcation of borders. The governor and planter elite supported the peace agreements. However, former indentured servants, along with other poor small land-owning freemen, hated it because it put limits on the availability of land. This will lead to Bacon's Rebellion, which I will get into later. Finally, a common question on AP tests is to compare Spanish, French, and British relations with Native Americans. Unlike the Spanish colonies, by and large, natives and English kept separate from each other. There was no great drive to convert the natives, and there were also few intermarriages. This was a little more relaxed in Virginia because of the lack of women, but societies overall did not coexist side by side, like in the Spanish colonies. In Massachusetts, right before the Pilgrims and Puritans came, disease had swept through the local tribes, severely reducing their numbers. There were early alliances with Native Americans to defeat other tribes, and both Native and Puritan villages were interspersed around each other. There was an uneasy truce between the groups, and the land and resources disagreements sprung up often. By the 1670s, these disagreements turned extremely violent and led to King Philip's, or Metacom's War. King Philip is what the Puritans called the main leader of the local tribes. This war was brutal, as atrocities were committed on both sides. However, the natives took the worst of it and lost. Okay, let's next take a look at local economies. In Virginia, tobacco becomes a huge focus, along with the headright system. Both of these lead to large plantations. The headright system was a way to reward people who brought over servants. So if you were able to pay your own way across the Atlantic, you got 50 acres of land. But if you were also able to pay for indentured servants to cross with you, then you received an additional 50 acres of land for every servant. So if you were wealthy in England, you were probably going to be wealthy in Virginia, as you could afford to bring over many servants. And in this era, in general, good quality farmland, and a lot of it, equals wealth. This led to a high level of inequality, as a small amount of planter elite were located around Jamestown and by the coast. Freedmen with small plots of land were further inland and close to the frontier. And there were landless vagrants. Many were former indentured servants. This high level of inequality is another reason for Bacon's Rebellion. Before going into the specifics of the Massachusetts economy, it is important to note that both Massachusetts and Virginia are under the British mercantilist economy. Some specific evidence for this are the Navigation Acts of 1660. What a mercantilist system means is nations restrict a colony's trade to that only with their mother country. So the settlers in Massachusetts Bay and Virginia cannot find the highest bidder for their goods on the open world market. They have to sell their products to only England. Tariffs and other means are used by European countries to try to have more exports than imports, and there is an overall goal to accumulate as much gold and silver as possible. Okay, back to the local economy of Massachusetts. The colony consisted mostly of subsistence farmers and fishermen. Their exports mainly consisted of dried fish, pelts, and timber. It is important to note that religion had a heavy influence on the local economy. There were rules based on the Puritan interpretation of the Bible that made exploitation in trade and usury illegal. There was some inequality in Massachusetts, but nowhere near the scale of Virginia. There were also indentured servants and slaves, but a small amount compared to Virginia and elsewhere in the New World. Now on to political matters. In Virginia, originally there were 7 leaders chosen by the company financing the venture. These 7 leaders, of which John Smith was one, would vote on issues. However, as the colony was floundering from starvation and war, it was taken over by the crown and turned into a royal colony. The governor was appointed by the king, while the House of Burgesses formed as the first European representative government in the Americas. It was dominated by the planter elite. Technically, all freedmen had votes, but still, the elite mostly maintained control until a guy named Nathaniel Bacon came around. The House of Burgesses could make laws. However, there was oversights by the governor, parliament, and king. Both Massachusetts and Virginia were under the British colonial system of having a charter with royal and parliamentary oversight. The commonwealths were organized differently from the Virginia colony. There were many villages with typically around 40 families. Male church members in the villages had voting power on a variety of issues, and some will point out that this is a representation of direct democracy. However, it is important to point out that females did not have any voting power, and many males were not full church members, as some were not Puritans, and some did not go through the entire process. Later, second and third generations will establish a halfway covenant, as some of the children and grandchildren of Puritan settlers will not be as pious as their elders. Many of the laws were generally based on Puritan interpretations of the Bible, like mandatory church meetings. Sabbath day is taken very seriously. No music, no dancing, no card playing, or any games of chance. These are seen as products of evil. Later on, a round of hysteria will sweep through and result in the Salem witch trials, which the community tried and hanged many supposed witches. The hysteria eventually abated, and a few years after the General Court of Massachusetts considered the trials unlawful, restitution was paid to the heirs of the previously condemned. Okay, let's talk about the role of religion in the two colonies. We already covered Massachusetts a lot, but in Virginia, most people followed the mainstream Anglican Church of England. There was mandatory church attendance on Sunday, and while the average Virginian of the time period would seem more devout than the average American today, however, for this time period, there was more of a devotion to tobacco and profit than religion. Whereas in Massachusetts, it could not be more opposite. Puritan Calvinist beliefs were everything in life, in which they pervaded every part of society, including the economy and government. The religious fervor increased and decreased at various points. Second and third generation Puritans tended to be less pious than their pioneering parents and grandparents. A halfway covenant or church membership was created to keep the less pious generations still attached to the church. However, in the early 1700s, the First Great Awakening spread across colonial America. It was most prominent in the middle and northern colonies. New Light preachers traveled across the colonies speaking in towns and villages. Jonathan Edwards was one of these most well-known New Light preachers, who spoke out against the halfway covenant. This evangelizing led to an increase in full church membership and even new sects of Christianity like Baptists and Methodists. Now let's talk about the difference between servants and slaves. Indentured servants were people who, for a paid passage to the colonies, endured a 4 to 7 year period of servitude. They had very little rights as a servant, however, more than a slave. And they could be of any race, while slavery was based upon race, lasted for life, and typically their children were slaves as well. Although an owner could do what is called manumission, which was to release a slave after a certain point or release a slave's children, which did happen, but was somewhat rare. Slaves had no rights at all. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, chattel laws further defined the property aspect of slaves. There were both servants and slaves in Massachusetts and Virginia. However, it was far more prevalent in Virginia on large tobacco plantations. Servitude in Virginia will die out in the later 1600s because of Bacon's Rebellion, which I keep teasing, and I promise it is just around the corner. Moving on to important leaders. In Massachusetts, there is no leader more prominent and important than John Winthrop. He was born into a wealthy merchant family in England. He trained as a lawyer. He was a founder of Massachusetts Bay Colony and a longtime leader. Either before or during the journey to the New World, Winthrop composed the famous primary source, A Model of Christian Charity, in which he used the phrase, "City upon the hill," derived from the Bible's Sermon on the Mount, to characterize the colonists' endeavor as part of a special pact with God to create a holy community. By the time you're watching this, I should have already completed a video that takes a closer look at a model of Christian charity. It is an incredibly popular source for College Board questions. There are a few other prominent figures in Massachusetts, but we will save them for our look at subversive individuals. In Virginia, some of the prominent leaders include John Smith, John Rolfe, who we already discussed. Also, you can tell John is a super popular name in the era. The other prominent leader in Virginia was Governor Berkeley, who we are about to discuss as a central figure in Bacon's Rebellion. Okay, let's check out some individuals that did not toe the colony line. First, we'll look at Massachusetts and Anne Hutchinson. While literacy rates for both males and females were high in New England, as it was important to be able to read the Bible, typically men did the interpreting of scripture and preaching. However, Anne Hutchinson was particularly adept in this area as an eloquent and knowledgeable preacher. She developed a following, and this was a bit out of the ordinary for a female. Most importantly about her preaching was she came to a different conclusion about the agreement with God, or covenant. She preached the covenant of grace, which was emphasized a person's individual relationship with God, while others, most notably previously mentioned major Puritan leader John Winthrop, preached the covenant of works. The main difference between the two is covenant of grace teaches that men obtain salvation out of God's good grace, whereas the covenant of works is the belief that a person can earn salvation through good works. This might sound minor to a modern ear, but it was a huge deal in Puritan times. Hutchinson would be put on trial for preaching heresy, and she defended herself well, but in the end, she was banished from Puritan communities. And later on, she was caught in the crossfire of a war between New Netherland and local Native American tribes, and she was killed. Then there was Roger Williams, who had the audacity to preach tolerance of natives and other Christian beliefs that were not Puritan. Williams developed a significant following, but other more conservative factions of Puritans disagreed with him. Eventually, Williams and his followers left to found Providence in the new colony of Rhode Island. Okay, finally we get to Bacon's rebellion in Virginia. I know I've been teasing this for the whole video. Nathaniel Bacon, the main figure of the rebellion against the planter elite, actually came from an elite aristocratic background. However, he was looked down upon by fellow planter elites and Governor Berkeley, who did not care for his brashness. Bacon was able to tap into the small-scale farmers and landless freemen frustrations. They hated the peace treaties with natives, which did not allow for expansion, thus limiting the availability of land. And they hated the perceived corrupt politics of the House of Burgesses, planter elite, and Governor Berkeley. Their main gripes were unfair taxes, failure to protect the frontier, and appointment of friends to key government positions. At first, Bacon tried the political route as he and allies won seats in the House of Burgesses. Before they could make any real changes, Governor Berkeley threw out the election. This ignited a war as Bacon and followers struck out against nearby native tribes and Jamestown. The rebels scored some early victories against the natives and then marched on Jamestown and burned it to the ground. However, the leader that held the rebellion together, Nathaniel Bacon, died of fever, and the rebellion fell apart. British authorities were able to wrestle back control, and some of Bacon's followers were imprisoned and executed. However, many were also pardoned. Governor Berkeley would lose his job and was recalled back to England, which helped to placate Bacon's followers. However, the rebellion had an unintended and monumental effect. The planter elite made a decision to switch from indentured servants to chattel slavery. Now, there was slavery before Bacon's rebellion, but that was mixed in with indentured servants. Servants, though, would eventually be freed, and many made up the landless poor, who were a constant problem for the planter elite. But switching fully to slavery would limit the amount of poor former indentured servants. Okay, so to wrap up, you might be thinking, those colonies are very different, but were there any similarities? This might be a serious ponder, especially if you have an essay to do on the topic. Well, in a general sense, yes, there were similarities. Both Massachusetts and Virginia were British colonies, with mostly British settlers and English-speaking. Both had a complicated relationship with local Native American tribes. Sometimes allies and trade partners, and sometimes vicious wars. While the focus of their economies was different, they both were still under the British mercantilist system. And finally, both had a degree of autonomy and self-government, albeit with British oversight. Today we're looking at a very important and influential document entitled A Model of Christian Charity, written by Massachusetts Bay Governor John Winthrop for the Arbella en route to the New World. Before looking at the key details of the document, let's take a look at the context. The colonization of the Americas had been going on for quite some time, and by the 1630s, Great Britain was playing catch-up to the other major European powers like Spain. While Great Britain was working on establishing colonies in the Caribbean, they also had their eye on the mainland. There were several failed attempts at colonies. However, the fledgling Jamestown colony was hanging on and found a niche in the cash crop tobacco. Back in England, several groups outside the mainstream Protestant sects had developed. One of these were the Puritans, who felt the Church of England, or Anglican Church, had not reformed itself enough after the split with the Roman Catholic Church. They faced some persecution back in England, and a small group called the Puritans set out for the New World, working to split with England and build a utopian community. Other Puritans also had similar ideas, but were looking to maintain a relationship with England. A group of investors and Puritans started the Massachusetts Bay Company and were able to obtain a royal charter, making their settlement legal and supported by the Crown. While technically any British person could settle in the colony, it remained mostly a Puritan endeavor and would attract around 20,000 settlers throughout the 1630s. A major leader of the settlement and governor was John Winthrop. Aboard the Arbella en route to Massachusetts Bay, he would compose a model of Christian charity, which has gone down as one of the most important and cited documents in U.S. history. So let's get into the key points of it. First off, Winthrop discusses his covenant of good works, which in the Puritan view is that mankind is called upon to act as God's stewards on earth and should help each other with distributing God's gift to others. Also, a man's circumstances are meant to test his character and virtue. He talks about how some are rich and some are poor, and God meant that to be because different social stations create community bonds. There are also two standard rules for this new colony, and that is justice and mercy. Winthrop also discusses what I believe is the heart of Christian charity, and that is to give without expecting to be paid back, and that all men are part of the body of Christ. When one part suffers, everyone suffers, so a community should help everyone in it. In the last part, Winthrop lays the groundwork for the colony he wants to see created. First, Christianity must be the common bond that knits it together, and government should be both civil and abide by Christian Puritan beliefs. He wants to create a better and more Christian society than the one they left behind in England, and God will reward the colony if they are virtuous, but also expect God's punishment if they are not. Winthrop also has this famous quote, which will be cited many times in future speeches across U.S. history. Quote, "For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." This quote goes to the core of American exceptionalism, that the U.S. is a virtuous country with a blessing of God that is inherently different from that of other countries, also has a unique mission to transform the world, and is superior over other countries. Finally, let's take a look at the intentions and legacy of a model of Christian charity. The author Winthrop is intending to set a purpose and define its core beliefs for the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This is from the point of view of a Puritan leader embarking on a difficult mission to start a colony in the New World. As far as the legacy goes, a model of Christian charity almost always comes up when talking about American exceptionalism. Many presidents and speakers will cite the United States as a city upon a hill. Today we're looking at another important source for APUSH, the Maryland Toleration Act, written by Lord Baltimore and passed by the Maryland Colonial Assembly in 1649. Before getting into the details of the source, let's take a look at the context. First, in a broad overview, the colonization of the Americas had been going on for more than a century. However, Great Britain was playing catch-up to the other major European powers, especially Spain. They had already established two colonies on firm footing prior to Maryland, the Virginia and Massachusetts Bay colonies. Also, back in England, even after the Protestant Reformation and the official split with the Roman Catholic Church, there remained some English Catholics. Internal strife between Catholics and Protestants led some Catholics to leave England in search of a more peaceful place. This is where we pick up the colony of Maryland. Founded by Cecil Calvert, aka Lord Baltimore, who intended the colony as a haven for English Catholics, the first arrivals were Catholics, including some priests. However, non-Catholics, including English Anglicans and Puritans, also settled in Maryland and soon outnumbered the Catholics. Continued religious strife in England led to violent conflict. However, Calvert and many in the colony did not want religious divisions to spread to the colony as well. So Calvert wrote the Toleration Act, and it was passed by the Assembly in 1649. Now let's take a look at specific details of the act. So there are two key points for the Toleration Act. First, it granted tolerance to only Christians, specifically Christians who believed in the Holy Trinity, which would include Catholics and most Protestants. So if you are one of those believers, you can freely practice your religion. We can see in this quote, "No person or persons professing to believe in Jesus Christ shall from henceforth be anyways troubled, molested, or discountenanced for or in respect of his or her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof within this province." However, if you're not a Christian, there is no toleration. And I've heard from some people, including students, say this is the Intoleration Act, especially if you speak out against Christianity. Then you could be executed and or your lands taken. Finally, let's take a look at the legacy of the act. There was considerable strife and war back in England between Anglicans, Catholics, and other Protestants, including an important character, Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan who ruled the British Isles as Lord Protector for a few years. This led to the Toleration Act being repealed. However, when things calmed down in England, it was reinstated again back in Maryland. But more issues several decades later led to another and permanent repeal. With that said, it is still considered a milestone act, and it influences other Toleration Acts in the colonies, which shows the greater religious independence settlers had in the colonies. Some say it influences the religious clause of the First Amendment. I'm a little skeptical of that, but the overall idea of the British colonies being a place of religious toleration, partly because the ethnic and religious diversity of them is important. So today, instead of a primary source, we're going to look at a key event for APUSH, and that is Pope's Rebellion, also known as the Pueblo Revolt. I find this topic really fascinating, especially its central character, Pope. However, I always found it a little awkward to cover in APUSH, because we spent the first time period and week in the Spanish colonies, and then for period 2, most of the time was spent on the British North American colonies, with the exception of this topic, which always feels like a backtrack to the Spanish colonies. However, if you research Pope's Rebellion in depth, I think anyone would find it fascinating. This video is just going to give a brief overview though. So this rebellion occurs in the modern-day American Southwest, specifically New Mexico, which in the 1600s was the Spanish frontier and far from the base of power in central Mexico. There was a trickle of Spanish soldiers and missionaries and settlers that continued to arrive in the area. However, they were vastly outnumbered by the Native Americans, even after diseases ravaged their population. There were many tribes, but overall, two distinct types of Native Americans. First were the more nomadic and warlike Apaches and Navajos, and second were the more settled Pueblos, which is what the Spanish referred to them as. In Spanish, Pueblo means town, so it's like saying townspeople. The Spanish in this region were particularly cruel to the Pueblos in suppressing their religion and demand for labor and crops and encomiendas. and also the Franciscan priests strictly suppressed traditional Pueblo practices. In the mid-1600s, there were some Spanish laws passed for a more humane treatment of Native Americans, but it did not seem to really affect this far-flung region. In the 1670s, an ecological calamity occurred in the region as a long period of drought set in an already dry region. And along with this, the Spanish proved unable to effectively protect the Pueblos from Apache raids. In 1675, major unrest set in amongst the Pueblos after the arrest of 40-plus traditional medicine men. Leaders from various Native American villages set out to Santa Fe to demand the release of these medicine men, who were being beaten and tortured. One prisoner was a medicine man named San Juan, who would become known as Pope. After his release, Pope went to Taos, New Mexico, which was somewhat outside of Spanish control, and for 5 years rounded up support for a rebellion. Pope promised his fellow Pueblos that the gods would reward them if they could expel the Spanish. The Spanish, already vastly outnumbered, were stretched particularly thin at this point in time dealing with the nomadic Apaches. They could only muster 170 soldiers against the 2,000-plus Pueblos. A massacre ensued, with the Pueblos targeting Spanish government officials, priests, and settlers, with hundreds more fleeing the area. Now New Mexico was in the hands of the Pueblos. Pope and his followers destroyed Christian churches and relics, and anything else of Spanish culture, including food and livestock. Pope did not end up ruling all of the Pueblos, as they went to mostly local self-government at the village level. To the Pueblos' dismay, the drought and raids by Apaches continued, and Pope's promises of rewards never came. He would lose favor with the Pueblos, who deposed him as a leader. The Spanish slowly attempted to return, offering clemency and more lenient rule. Many villages would return to the Spanish fold. However, a few remained free from Spanish rule ever after. Okay, so what are the key takeaways for APUSH? First, the Pueblo Revolt shows Native American resistance to European or Spanish colonial rule. And the other key point is that after the revolt, the Spanish are more tolerant and accommodating to Native American culture. Now, it is debatable as to why the Spanish are more tolerant. Did they truly have a change of heart about their cool treatment of Native Americans, or was it more a practical and pragmatic reason of avoiding rebellion and chaos on their frontier regions? Today, we're looking at a major Period 2 topic, the First Great Awakening, and a primary source central to that topic, Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. To start, let's take a look at the First Great Awakening. Roughly the time period of the Great Awakening goes from the 1730s to the 1770s. We will mostly focus on the impacts in colonial America, but note that this is also an international movement, as it is also occurring across Europe, which shows an example of the transatlantic exchange of ideas. Core to the Great Awakening is the revitalization of religious piety. Some may say it is a counter to the more secular Enlightenment movement amongst educated elites, and at the very least, it runs concurrent to it. Another major facet of the First Great Awakening is the distinction between the Old Light preachers, who are more likely to be longtime hometown ministers and offer a more conservative or moderate style and content to their sermons, versus the New Light preachers, who are a major part of the First Great Awakening. They were more likely to be traveling preachers that attracted huge crowds to their sermons, which were filled with raucous hellfire and brimstone style oration. And many times the crowds would participate with shouts along the lines of, "Save me." Two of the major New Light preachers you might see on the AP tests are Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, both of whom spoke of terrifying images of the corruption of human nature and terrors awaiting unbelievers and sinners who did not repent. Also, the First Great Awakening is an excellent example of Protestant evangelism, or the practice of spreading of Christianity. In Period 1, we talked a lot about how the Roman Catholic Church had major goals of spreading Christianity. For Protestants, the First Great Awakening is an example for them. And finally, the First Great Awakening and the traveling New Light preachers were particularly popular in the rural backcountry across colonial America. Okay, let's briefly touch upon Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. For APUSH, we do not need to do a deep dive on the content or literary aspects of the reading, so this will be brief. To begin, this is considered the hallmark sermon of the First Great Awakening, and it encapsulates many of the Great Awakening's core ideas. In the sermon itself, there is a lot of discussion of how the wicked or sinners deserve to be in hell, and at any moment, God can or will send them there. However, God has some restraint and gives many people the time to save themselves by accepting Jesus Christ and repenting their sins. Edwards delivers his sermon at the invitation of a Connecticut preacher who was worried about his congregation, and so Edwards' purpose was to teach about how sin and rejection of Christ can lead to the horrors of hell. It is important to note the whole thing is not just about the negative consequence of hell, but Edwards balances it out with the prospect of salvation. And in other speeches, Edwards has a lot to say about heaven, but those are not as widely known or read. Lastly, the legacy. There is an argument the First Great Awakening helped usher in the revolution because it showed how more people turned away from traditional authorities. You just need to sub out Old Light preachers for British government officials, and to a lesser extent away from the Anglican Church of England. as the First Great Awakening was able to attract converts to Methodist and Baptist churches. However, most colonists were not in the Anglican Church beforehand. Finally, an important side note, there will be more Great Awakenings, and of special importance is the Second Great Awakening, which is a major event in Period 4. However, the Second Great Awakening will look very different from the first, and will have very different effects. Today we're looking at the Albany Plan of Union, created in 1754, as an attempt to organize a unified colonial government. Before getting into the document, let's take a look at the context. Before 1754, the British North American colonies had experienced a great deal of autonomy in their local affairs. Economically, they were under the British mercantilist system, which officially restricted trade to only Great Britain, and there were taxes on various goods. However, these taxes were not strictly enforced, and smuggling was rampant. The colonies were also able to have some control over their local governments and policies. The British policy of loose control over the colonies is called salutary neglect. Even with salutary neglect, the colonies were very much connected to Great Britain, as many of their resources went to their mother country, and most of the finished goods that were bought and sold came from Great Britain. However, the colonies were fairly disconnected from each other. There were very few roads between the colonies and not much trade between them. Now let's narrow in on the developments around 1754. In that year, the French and Indian War began, which was a major war between Great Britain and her Indian allies against the French and their Indian allies. Focusing just on the North American aspect of the conflict, the two empires disputed the claims over the Ohio River Valley, which lay west of the Appalachian Mountains. A lot of fighting would occur in the frontier region. For Americans, this meant the western, rural, and fairly unprotected areas of their colonies. American colonists felt vulnerable, so colonial leaders wanted to devise a plan to better protect their western frontier regions, and Ben Franklin and others met in Albany, New York to come up with a solution. Taking a look at the key points of the Albany Plan of Union itself, it is first and foremost created for the purpose of providing a common colonial defense. The plan called for the creation of a general government to be administered by a crown-appointed President General and a Grand Council of delegates from the colonies. Side note, this is similar to how many of the colonial legislatures were set up in the individual colonies. The plan specifically mentions the government could regulate trade with Native Americans, raise and pay soldiers, build forts, create a coast guard, and allowed for possible taxation. That last part would be controversial, and in Ben Franklin's view, one of the reasons it will not pass in the colonial legislatures. Ben Franklin and the other colonial leaders who created the Albany Plan of Union were intending to find a solution to the vulnerability of the colonies, especially colonists who were close to the frontier, and even more so during times of war between colonial empires like the French and British. They were also looking to establish ties and better communication amongst the colonies, so they could coordinate their efforts in times of strife. Finally, the plan is also to somewhat unify the colonies, which up to this point were very distinct from each other. Looking at who would agree and disagree with the plan, viewpoints were mixed amongst the colonists. Ben Franklin and some colonial leaders were in favor of the plan and saw the possible benefits of unity and collective action. However, when the plan was sent to colonial legislatures for approval, it failed. Colonial legislatures were wary of losing local power to an intercolonial government and saw the colonies as more separate than together. The British also disapproved of the plan. Ben Franklin blamed the failure of the Albany Plan of Union on inward-looking legislatures and a distaste for a central taxing authority. Even though it failed, the Albany Plan of Union was very influential to future efforts of colonial unity. Possibly the most important aspect is it got colonists discussing the idea of colonial unity and common action. Key individuals were able to develop relationships with one another, and it opened up communication amongst colonial leaders. Later, after the French and Indian War, when salutary neglect was done away with, and the British took a more hands-on approach with North America, colonial leaders rekindled the idea of collective action and formed several congresses to protest repressive British laws and taxes. And eventually, one of the congresses, the Second Continental Congress, would go on to declare independence from Great Britain. Hello, APUSHers. Today we're looking at key terms for Period 2. These terms come straight out of the College Board framework for AP US History and are many times in questions and possible responses on AP US History exams. I highly recommend taking notes during the video as that will help with retention. Okay, let's jump into it. First, let's pick up where we left off in Period 1, and that is Spanish colonization. During Period 2, Spain continued to expand their power and control over their colonies in the New World, along with their caste-based racial hierarchical system that dominated the social, political, and economic structure of their colonies. In Period 2, they were now in more direct competition with France and Great Britain in the transatlantic trade. Also, several conflicts broke out between Spain and rising European powers. And by the end of the period, Spain had started a long, slow decline in power and prestige. We're going to take a quick look at French colonization of North America. As you can see on the right in blue and purple, the French claimed large swaths of territory from New Orleans up to eastern Canada. In the more northern reaches of modern-day Canada, the French focused on the fur trade in the Hudson Bay and St. Lawrence areas. It was only lightly populated by the French, who struck treaties and fur trade agreements with native tribes. There was a considerable amount of intermarriage between French traders and settlers, and Native Americans. And the French did have numerous Catholic priests and orders focused on converting the Native Americans, unlike the nearby British colonies. The British began colonization a little later than other European powers. They focused more on trade than conversion of natives to Christianity. Their colonies were also safe havens for various groups, including Puritans and Quakers. The British were also more homogeneous than the Spanish, with very little intermarriage with natives or Africans. The map on the right shows their colonies on the mainland. However, most of their activity in Period 2 was in the Caribbean. In the Spanish colonies, and to a lesser extent the French colonies, there was a great amount of mixing between Spanish, Native Americans, and Africans. For the Spanish colonies, this resulted in a complex racial caste system seen on the right. There were different rules and laws for each caste. Those on top had the most privilege, while those on the bottom had the least. This is contrasted with the British, which stayed much more homogeneous. Indentured servants were a labor force for colonies in the New World. It is different from slavery. Servants were poor or possibly imprisoned Europeans, who in return for their passage to the New World, contracted their labor out for a period of time, typically in the 5 to 7 year range. The servant had very few rights while indentured, but once the contract was completed, they were free. This system was ripe with corruption, as some masters treated their servants horribly, and extended a servant's contract if they disobeyed or tried to escape. The transatlantic slave trade occurred roughly from the early 16th century to the mid-19th century. It is hard to know for sure the exact numbers, but historians estimated that the trade transported around 12.5 million enslaved Africans to the New World. Once in the New World, enslaved Africans were forced to perform many types of jobs. Most of them toiled away on cash crop plantations, especially sugar and tobacco early on, and later cotton. Harsh chattel laws were passed in many colonies, making slavery race-based, and those laws typically cut off any path to legal freedom for an enslaved person. Africans also resisted enslavement in two ways, the first being overt resistance, which included running away in rebellions like the Stono or Nat Turner. Later on in Periods 4 and 5, we will discuss the whole network of helping escape slaves called the Underground Railroad. Overt was not the only way Africans resisted enslavement, as there were constant acts of covert resistance, which include some examples like working slowly, faking an illness, and stealing food. Moving on to a different topic, Puritans were British Protestants who followed Calvin's teachings and believed in predestination. They felt the Anglican Church did not reform itself enough after the split with Catholicism. At times they were persecuted in England. Some pilgrims set off to completely separate themselves from England. These were the settlers who crossed the Atlantic in the Mayflower and set up the Plymouth colony. Others worked within the colonial framework to establish a colony based in Puritan beliefs. This was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which eventually will engulf the Plymouth colony. When the British settled in North America, they had a much more homogeneous society than the Spanish or French colonies. A homogeneous society means a society that shares the same traits like language and culture. This is in contrast to the Spanish, who had a lot more intermixing in their colonies between Spanish, Africans, and Native Americans. Now on to the Middle Colonies, which were very diverse compared to the more Puritan New England and cash crop focused Virginia areas. There's a lot I could say about all of these colonies, but let's keep it brief to just the notable information for APUSH. Pennsylvania will be secured as a safe haven for pacifist and nonconformist Quakers, and that colony will focus on wheat production. And New York actually started out as a Dutch colony, with New York City being first called New Amsterdam. After some shenanigans in Europe, the Dutch basically gave New York to the British. The now New York City is known for its good harbor and position on the East Coast that allowed it to grow to a major center of trade. The Middle Colonies became the early breadbasket of the British colonies. They produced surpluses of wheat and corn, which are referred to as staple crops. These crops helped feed other areas of the colonies that produced less food and more cash crops like Virginia. They were also exported to England. For the Pueblo Revolt, we go back to the Spanish colonies, and specifically Spanish New Mexico, where Native Americans were treated very poorly by the Spanish, including suppressing their traditional beliefs and putting huge demands on native labor. The Pueblo Native Americans rebelled against Spanish officials, priests, and settlers, and for a short period of time had driven them out of the region. However, the Spanish would return, but they became more tolerant and accommodating to Native American beliefs and culture. I went into a lot more detail in a separate video specifically about the topic, so check that out. Okay, next important term. The British had a strong viewpoint on property rights and contracts when it applied to dealings between each other. However, in colonizing North America, British settlers pushed against Native American territory, resulting in conflict with Native Americans, and usually Native Americans being pushed off their land. This was in part due to feelings of superiority over Native Americans. In general, Great Britain and Europe had a very patriarchal society. Women, if married, had no claim to property or even children if the marriage was annulled. They believed women had their sphere, which was housework, raising children, subservient to their husband, and being pious and moral center of the family, while the men's sphere was outdoor work, drinking in the tavern with mates, and the leader of the family in business or political matters. So when referring to the Atlantic world, we are talking about the political, cultural, and economic exchanges around the Atlantic Ocean because of the interactions between Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans. This also heavily impacted the development of the colonies in North America and led to economic growth in several European countries, including Spain and England. It also changed labor systems as well as expanded social networks. Finally, the labor market exchange of European and New World goods impacted the Atlantic economy, as shown in the transatlantic slave trade and shipment of products and resources from the Americas to Europe. Okay, onto the Enlightenment, which is a European intellectual movement throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. It focused on rational thought, science, and logic. Some of its most influential philosophers were John Locke, Adam Smith, and Descartes. Their ideas of self-government and natural rights, especially Locke's, will have a great influence on colonial American leaders like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine. We will revisit those ideas with the Declaration of Independence and Common Sense in Period 3. Roughly the time period of the First Great Awakening goes from the 1730s to the 1770s. We will mostly focus on the impacts in colonial America, but note that this is also an international movement, as it is also occurring in Europe, which shows an example of transatlantic exchange of ideas. Core to the Great Awakening is the revitalization of religious piety. Some may say it is a counter to the more secular Enlightenment movement popular among educated elites, and at the very least, it runs concurrent to it. Another major facet to the First Great Awakening is the distinction between the old light preachers, who are more likely to be longtime hometown ministers and offer a more conservative or moderate style and content to their sermons, versus the new light preachers, who are a major part of the First Great Awakening. They were more likely to be traveling preachers that attracted huge crowds to their sermons, which were filled with raucous hellfire and brimstone style oration, and many times the crowds would participate with shouts along the lines of, "Save me." Two of the major New Light preachers you will see on the AP test are Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, both of whom spoke of terrifying images of the corruption of human nature and terrors awaiting unbelievers and sinners who did not repent. Also, the First Great Awakening is an excellent example of Protestant evangelism, or the practice of spreading Christianity. In Period 1, we talked a lot about the Roman Catholic Church and its major goals of spreading Christianity. For Protestants, the First Great Awakening is an example for them. And finally, the First Great Awakening and the traveling New Light preachers were particularly popular in the rural backcountry across colonial America. Finally is the economic policy of mercantilism, which was employed by the colonizing European powers that sought to maximize exports and limit imports through a highly regulated trading network. These policies aimed to increase their wealth, usually meaning gold and silver of a nation, so it would increase its power and prestige. Looking specifically at the British, they tried to create a closed system of trade between their colonies and mother country. The Navigation Acts are a great example of this. At the same time, they tried to increase their exports like textiles from their mother country to their colonies and other European powers. Everything going in and out was taxed. Important note, the American colonies were always trying to sidestep this system with ignoring the export rules and taxes. When the British clamped down in Period 3, this will be a major cause of the revolution. Okay, that does it for the explanations of the key terms in Period 2. Please subscribe and share the channel with your fellow classmates and teachers. With many districts going to hybrid or distance learning this year, it could be a great aid to both.